Indian Summer of a Forsyte, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, in Chancery, Indian Summer of a Forsyte, Part 1. On the last day of May, in the early 90s, about 6 o'clock of the evening, old Jolyon Forsyte sat under the oak tree below the terrace of his house at Robin Hill. He was waiting for the midges to bite him, before abandoning the glory of the afternoon. His thin brown hand, where blue veins stood out, held the end of a cigar in its tapering, long-nailed fingers. A pointed polished nail had survived with him from those earlier Victorian days when to touch nothing, even with the tips of the fingers, had been so distinguished. His domed forehead, great white moustache, lean cheeks, and long lean jaw were covered from the westering sunshine by an old brown Panama hat. His legs were crossed. In all his attitude was serenity and a kind of elegance, as of an old man who every morning put eau de cologne upon his silk handkerchief. At his feet lay a woolly brown and white dog, trying to be a Pomeranian. The dog Balthazar, between whom and old Jolyon primal aversion had changed into attachment with the years. Close to his chair was a swing, and on the swing was seated one of Holly's dolls, called Duffer Alice, with her body fallen over her legs and her doleful nose buried in a black petticoat. She was never out of disgrace, so it did not matter to her how she sat. Below the oak tree the lawn dipped down a bank, stretched to the fernery, and beyond that refinement became fields, dropping to the pond, the coppice, and the prospect. Fine, remarkable, at which Swithin Forsyte, from under this very tree, had stared 5 years ago, when he drove down with Irene to look at the house. Old Jolyon had heard of his brother's exploit, that drive, which had become quite celebrated on Forsyte's 'Change. Swithin! And the fellow had gone and died last November, at the age of only 79, renewing the doubt whether Forsytes could live for ever, which had first arisen when Aunt Ann passed away, died, and left only Jolyon and James, Roger and Nicholas and Timothy, Julia, Hester, Susan. And old Jolyon thought, 85, I don't feel it, except when I get that pain. His memory went searching. He had not felt his age since he had bought his nephew Soames's ill-starred house and settled into it here at Robin Hill over 3 years ago. It was as if he had been getting younger every spring, living in the country with his son and his grandchildren, June and the little ones of the second marriage, Jolly and Holly, living down here, out of the racket of London and the cackle of Forsyte's 'Change, free of his boards, in a delicious atmosphere of no work and all play, with plenty of occupation in the perfecting and mellowing of the house, and its 20 acres, and in ministering to the whims of Holly and Jolly. All the knots and crankiness which had gathered in his heart during that long and tragic business of June, Soames, Irene his wife, and poor young Bosinney had been smoothed out. Even June had thrown off her melancholy at last. Witness this travel in Spain she was taking now with her father and her stepmother. Curiously perfect peace was left by their departure, blissful yet blank, because his son was not there. Joe was never anything but a comfort and a pleasure to him nowadays, an amiable chap. But women, somehow, even the best, got a little on one's nerves, unless, of course, one admired them. Far off a cuckoo called. A wood pigeon was cooing from the first elm tree in the field. And how the daisies and buttercups had sprung up after the last mowing! The wind had got into the southwest too. A delicious air, sappy. He pushed his head back and let the sun fall on his chin and cheek. Somehow today he wanted company, wanted a pretty face to look at. People treated the old as if they wanted nothing, and with the unforsytean philosophy which ever intruded on his soul, he thought, one has never had enough. With a foot in the grave, one will want something. I shouldn't be surprised. Down here, away from the exigencies of affairs, his grandchildren and the flowers, trees, birds of his little domain, to say nothing of sun and moon and stars above them, said, "Open, Sesame," to him day and night. And Sesame had opened. How much, perhaps, he did not know. He had always been responsive to what they had begun to call nature. Genuinely, almost religiously responsive, though he had never lost his habit of calling a sunset and a view, however deeply they might move him. But nowadays nature actually made him ache. He appreciated it so. Every one of these calm, bright, lengthening days, with Holly's hand in his, and the dog Balthasar in front looking studiously for what he never found, he would stroll watching the roses open, fruit budding on the walls, sunlight brightening the oak leaves and saplings in the coppice, watching the water-lily leaves unfold and glisten, and the silvery young corn of the one wheat field, listening to the starlings and skylarks, and the Alderney cows chewing the cud, flicking slow their tufted tails. And every one of these fine days he ached a little from sheer love of it all, feeling perhaps deep down that he had not very much longer to enjoy it. The thought that some day, perhaps not 10 years hence, perhaps not 5, all this world would be taken away from him, before he had exhausted his powers of loving it, seemed to him in the nature of an injustice brooding over his horizon. If anything came after this life, it would not be what he wanted. Not Robin Hill and flowers and birds and pretty faces, too few even now of those about him. With the years his dislike of humbug had increased. The orthodoxy he had worn in the 60s, as he had worn side whiskers out of sheer exuberance, had long dropped off, leaving him reverent before 3 things alone: beauty, upright conduct, and a sense of property. And the greatest of these now was beauty. He had always had wide interest, and indeed could still read the Times, but he was liable at any moment to put it down if he heard a blackbird sing. Upright conduct, property, somehow they were tiring. The blackbirds and the sunsets never tired him, only gave him an uneasy feeling that he could not get enough of them. staring into the stilly radiance of the early evening, and at the little gold and white flowers on the lawn, a thought came to him. This weather was like the music of Orfeo, which he had recently heard at Covent Garden. A beautiful opera, not like Meyerbeer, nor even quite Mozart, but in its way perhaps even more lovely. Something classical and of the golden age about it, chaste and mellow, and the Ravoglis almost worthy of the old days. Highest praise he could bestow. The yearning of Orpheus for the beauty he was losing, for his love going down to Hades, as in life, love and beauty did go, the yearning which sang and throbbed through the golden music, stirred also in the lingering beauty of the world that evening. And with the tip of his cork-soled, elastic-sided boot he involuntarily stirred the ribs of the dog Balthazar, causing the animal to wake and attack his fleas, for though he was supposed to have none, nothing could persuade him of the fact. When he had finished, he rubbed the place he had been scratching against his master's calf, and settled down again with his chin over the instep of the disturbing boot. And into old Jolyon's mind came a sudden recollection, a face he had seen at the opera 3 weeks ago. Irene, the wife of his precious nephew Soames, that man of property. Though he had not met her since the day of the "at home" in his old house at Stanhope Gate, which celebrated his granddaughter June's ill-starred engagement to young Bosinney, he had remembered her at once, for he had always admired her, a very pretty creature. After the death of young Bosinney, whose mistress she had so reprehensibly become, he had heard that she had left Soames at once. Goodness only knew what she had been doing since. That sight of her face, a side view, in the row in front, had been literally the only reminder these 3 years that she was still alive. No one ever spoke of her. And yet Jo had told him something once, something which had upset him completely. The boy had got it from George Forsyte, he believed, who had seen Bosinney in the fog the day he was run over, something which explained the young fellow's distress, an act of Soames towards his wife, a shocking act. Jo had seen her too that afternoon, after the news was out, seen her for a moment, and his description had always lingered in old Jolyon's mind. Wild and lost, he had called her. And next day June had gone there, bottled up her feelings and gone there, and the maid had cried and told her how her mistress had slipped out in the night and vanished. A tragic business altogether. One thing was certain, Soames had never been able to lay hands on her again. And he was living at Brighton and journeying up and down, a fitting fate, the man of property. For when he once took a dislike to anyone, as he had to his nephew, old Jolyon never got over it. He remembered still the sense of relief with which he had heard the news of Irene's disappearance. It had been shocking to think of her a prisoner in that house, to which she must have wandered back when Jo saw her, wandered back for a moment, like a wounded animal to its hole after seeing that news, tragic death of an architect in the street. Her face had struck him very much the other night, more beautiful than he had remembered, but like a mask, with something going on beneath it. A young woman still, 28 perhaps. Ah well! Very likely she had another lover by now. But at this subversive thought, for married women should never love, once even had been too much, his instep rose, and with it the dog Balthazar's head. The sagacious animal stood up and looked into old Jolyon's face. "Walk?" he seemed to say, and old Jolyon answered, "Come on, old chap." Slowly, as was their wont, they crossed among the constellations of buttercups and daisies, and entered the fernery. This feature, where very little grew as yet, had been judiciously dropped below the level of the lawn, so that it might come up again on the level of the other lawn, and give the impression of irregularity so important in horticulture. Its rocks and earth were beloved of the dog Balthazar, who sometimes found a mole there. Old Jolyon made a point of passing through it because, though it was not beautiful, he intended that it should be some day, and he would think, "I must get Var to come down and look at it, he's better than Beech." For plants, like houses and human complaints, required the best expert consideration. It was inhabited by snails, and if accompanied by his grandchildren, he would point to one and tell them the story of the little boy who said, "Have plumbers got leggers, mother?" "No, sonny." "Then darned if I haven't been and swallowed a snileybob." And when they skipped and clutched his hand, thinking of the snileybob going down the little boy's red lane, his eyes would twinkle. Emerging from the fernery, he opened the wicket gate, which just there led into the first field, a large and park-like area, out of which, within brick walls, the vegetable garden had been carved. Old Jolyon avoided this, which did not suit his mood, and made down the hill towards the pond. Balthazar, who knew a water rat or two, gambolled in front, at the gait which marks an oldish dog who takes the same walk every day. Arrived at the edge, old Jolyon stood, noting another water lily opened since yesterday. He would show it to Holly to-morrow, when his little sweet had got over the upset which had followed on her eating a tomato at lunch. Her little arrangements were very delicate. Now that Jolly had gone to school, his first term, Holly was with him nearly all day long, and he missed her badly. He felt that pain too, which often bothered him now, a little dragging at his left side. He looked back up the hill. Really, poor young Bosinney had made an uncommonly good job of the house. He would have done very well for himself if he had lived. And where was he now? Perhaps still haunting this, the site of his last work, of his tragic love affair. Or was Philip Bosinney's spirit diffused in the general? Who could say? That dog was getting his legs muddy. And he moved towards the coppice. There had been the most delightful lot of bluebells, and he knew where some still lingered, like little patches of sky fallen in between the trees, away out of the sun. He passed the cow-houses and the hen-houses there installed, and pursued a path into the thick of the saplings, making for one of the bluebell plots. Balthazar, preceding him once more, uttered a low growl. Old Jolyon stirred him with his foot, but the dog remained motionless, just where there was no room to pass, and the hair rose slowly along the centre of his woolly back. Whether from the growl and the look of the dog's stivert hair, or from the sensation which a man feels in a wood, old Jolyon also felt something move along his spine. And then the path turned, and there was an old mossy log, and on it a woman sitting. Her face was turned away, and he had just time to think, "She's trespassing. I must have a board put up," before she turned. Powers above! The face he had seen at the opera, the very woman he had just been thinking of. In that confused moment he saw things blurred as if a spirit. Queer effect. The slant of sunlight perhaps on her violet grey frock. And then she rose and stood smiling, her head a little to one side. Old Jolyon thought, "How pretty she is!" She did not speak, neither did he. And he realized why with a certain admiration. She was here no doubt because of some memory, and did not mean to try and get out of it by vulgar explanation. "Don't let that dog touch your frock," he said. "He has got wet feet. Come here, you." But the dog Balthasar went on towards the visitor, who put her hand down and stroked his head. Old Jolyon said quickly, "I saw you at the opera the other night. You didn't notice me." "Oh yes, I did." He felt a subtle flattery in that, as though she had added, "Do you think one could miss seeing you?" "They are all in Spain," he remarked abruptly. "I am alone. I drove up for the opera. The Ravogli's was good. Have you seen the cowhouses?" In a situation so charged with mystery and something very like emotion, he moved instinctively towards that bit of property, and she moved beside him. Her figure swayed faintly, like the best kind of French figures. Her dress, too, was a sort of French grey. He noticed 2 or 3 silver threads in her amber-coloured hair, strange hair, with those dark eyes of hers, and that creamy pale face. A sudden sidelong look from the velvety brown eyes disturbed him. It seemed to come from deep and far, from another world almost, or at all events from someone not living very much in this. And he said mechanically, "Where are you living now?" "I have a little flat in Chelsea." He did not want to hear what she was doing, did not want to hear anything, but the perverse word came out. "Alone?" She nodded. It was a relief to know that. And it came into his mind that, but for a twist of fate, she would have been mistress of this coppice, showing these cow-houses to him, a visitor. "All Alderneys," he muttered. "They give the best milk. This one is a pretty creature. Wah! Myrtle!" The fawn-coloured cow, with eyes as soft and brown as Irene's own, was standing absolutely still, not having long been milked. She looked round at them out of the corner of those lustrous, mild, cynical eyes, and from her grey lips a little dribble of saliva threaded its way towards the straw. The scent of hay and vanilla and ammonia rose in the dim light of the cool cow-house, and old Jolyon said, "You must come up and have some dinner with me. I'll send you home in the carriage." He perceived a struggle going on within her, natural, no doubt, with her memories. But he wanted her company, a pretty face, a charming figure, beauty. He had been alone all the afternoon. Perhaps his eyes were wistful, for she answered, "Thank you, Uncle Jolyon, I should like to." He rubbed his hands and said, Capital! Let us go up then." And preceded by the dog Balthazar, they ascended through the field. The sun was almost level in their faces now, and he could see not only those silver threads, but little lines just deep enough to stamp her beauty with a coin-like fineness, the special look of life unshared with others. "I will take her in by the terrace," he thought. "I won't make a common visitor of her." "What do you do all day?" he said. "Teach music. I have another interest too." "Work," said old Jolyon, picking up the doll from off the swing and smoothing its black petticoat. "Nothing like it, is there? I don't do any now. I'm getting on." "What interest is that?" "Trying to help women who have come to grief." Old Jolyon did not quite understand. "To grief?" he repeated, then realized with a shock that she meant exactly what he would have meant himself if he had used that expression. Assisting the Magdalens of London! What a weird and terrifying interest! And curiosity overcoming his natural shrinking, he asked: "Why? What do you do for them?" "Not much. I have no money to spare. I can only give sympathy and food sometimes." Involuntarily old Jolyon's hand sought his purse. He said hastily: "How do you get hold of them?" "I go to a hospital." "A hospital! Phew! What hurts me most is that once they nearly all had some sort of beauty." Old Jolyon straightened the doll. "Beauty!" he ejaculated. "Ha! Yes, a sad business." And he moved towards the house. Through a French window, under the sun blinds not yet drawn up, he preceded her into the room where he was wont to study the Times and the sheets of an agricultural magazine with huge illustrations of mangold wurzels and the like, which provided Holly with material for her paint-brush. "Dinner is in half an hour. You would like to wash your hands. I will take you to June's room." He saw her looking round eagerly. What changes since she had last visited this house with her husband, or her lover, or both perhaps, he did not know, could not say. All that was dark, and he wished to leave it so. But what changes? And in the hall he said: "My boy Joe is a painter, you know. He has got a lot of taste. It isn't mine, of course, but I have let him have his way." She was standing very still, her eyes roaming through the hall and music room as it now was, all thrown into one under the great skylight. Old Jolyon had an odd impression of her. Was she trying to conjure somebody from the shades of that space where the colouring was all pearl grey and silver? He would have had gold himself, more lively and solid. But Joe had French tastes, and it had come out shadowy like that, with an effect as of the fume of cigarettes the chap was always smoking, broken here and there by a little blaze of blue or crimson colour. It was not his dream. Mentally he had hung this space with those gold-framed masterpieces of still and stiller life, which he had bought in days when quantity was precious. And now, where were they? Sold for a song. That something which made him alone among Forsytes move with the times had warned him against the struggle to retain them. But in his study he still had Dutch fishing boats at sunset. He began to mount the stairs with her, slowly, for he felt his side. "These are the bathrooms," he said, "and other arrangements. I have had them tiled. The nurseries are along there, and this is Jo's and his wife's. They all communicate. But you remember, I expect." Irene nodded. They passed on up the gallery and entered a large room with a small bed and several windows. "This is mine," he said. The walls were covered with the photographs of children and watercolor sketches, and he added doubtfully, "These are Jo's. The view is first rate. You can see the grandstand at Epsom in clear weather." The sun was down now behind the house, and over the prospect a luminous haze had settled, emanation of the long and prosperous day. Few houses showed, but fields and trees faintly glistened away to a loom of downs. "The country is changing," he said abruptly, "but there it will be when we are all gone. Look at those thrushes. The birds are sweet here in the mornings. I am glad to have washed my hands of London." Her face was close to the window pane, and he was struck by its mournful look. "Wish I could make her look happy," he thought. "A pretty face, but sad." And taking up his can of hot water, he went out into the gallery. "This is June's room," he said, opening the next door and putting the can down. "I think you'll find everything." And closing the door behind her, he went back to his own room. Brushing his hair with his great ebony brushes, and dabbing his forehead with eau de Cologne, he mused. She had come so strangely. A sort of visitation, mysterious, even romantic, as if his desire for company, for beauty, had been fulfilled by whatever it was which fulfilled that sort of thing. And before the mirror he straightened his still upright figure, passed the brushes over his great white moustache, touched up his eyebrows with eau de Cologne, and rang the bell. "I forgot to let them know that I have a lady to dinner with me. Let cook do something extra. And tell Beacon to have the landau and pair at 10:30 to drive her back to town tonight. Is Miss Holly asleep?" The maid thought not, and old Jolyon, passing down the gallery, stole on tiptoe towards the nursery and opened the door, whose hinges he kept specially oiled that he might slip in and out in the evenings without being heard. But Holly was asleep, and lay like a miniature Madonna, of that type which the old painters could not tell from Venus when they had completed her. Her long dark lashes clung to her cheeks. On her face was perfect peace. Her little arrangements were evidently all right again. And old Jolyon, in the twilight of the room, stood adoring her. It was so charming, solemn and loving, that little face. He had more than his share of the blessed capacity of living again in the young. They were to him his future life, all of a future life that his fundamental pagan sanity perhaps admitted. There she was, with everything before her, and his blood, some of it, in her tiny veins. There she was, his little companion, to be made as happy as ever he could make her, so that she knew nothing but love. His heart swelled, and he went out, stilling the sound of his patent leather boots. In the corridor an eccentric notion attacked him. To think that children should come to that which Irene had told him she was helping. Women, who were all once little things like this one sleeping there. "I must give her a cheque," he mused. "Can't bear to think of them." They had never borne reflecting on, those poor outcasts, wounding too deeply the core of true refinement hidden under layers of conformity to the sense of property, wounding too grievously the deepest thing in him, a love of beauty which could give him even now a flutter of the heart, thinking of his evening in the society of a pretty woman. And he went downstairs through the swinging doors to the back regions. There, in the wine cellar, was a hock worth at least £2 a bottle, a Steinberg cabinet, better than any Johannesburg that ever went down throat, a wine of perfect bouquet, sweet as a nectarine. Nectar, indeed! He got a bottle out, handling it like a baby, and holding it level to the light to look. Enshrined in its coat of dust, that mellow-coloured, slender-necked bottle gave him deep pleasure. 3 years to settle down again since the move from town ought to be in prime condition. 35 years ago he had bought it. Thank God, he had kept his palate and earned the right to drink it. She would appreciate this. Not a spice of acidity in a dozen. He wiped the bottle, drew the cork with his own hands, put his nose down, inhaled its perfume, and went back to the music room. Irene was standing by the piano. She had taken off her hat and the lace scarf she had been wearing, so that her gold-coloured hair was visible and the pallor of her neck. In her grey frock she made a pretty picture for old Jolyon against the rosewood of the piano. He gave her his arm, and solemnly they went. The room, which had been designed to enable 24 people to dine in comfort, held now but a little round table. In his present solitude the big dining table oppressed old Jolyon. He had caused it to be removed till his son came back. Here, in the company of 2 really good copies of Raphael Madonnas, he was wont to dine alone. It was the only disconsolate hour of his day, this summer weather. He had never been a large eater, like that great chap Swithin, or Sylvanus Haythorpe, or Anthony Thornworthy, those cronies of past times, and to dine alone, overlooked by the Madonnas, was to him but a sorrowful occupation, which he got through quickly, that he might come to the more spiritual enjoyment of his coffee and cigar. But this evening was a different matter. His eyes twinkled at her across the little table, and he spoke of Italy and Switzerland, telling her stories of his travels there and other experiences, which he could no longer recount to his son and granddaughter because they knew them. This fresh audience was precious to him. He had never become one of those old men who ramble round and round the fields of reminiscence. Himself quickly fatigued by the insensitive, he instinctively avoided fatiguing others, and his natural flirtatiousness towards beauty guarded him specially in his relations with a woman. He would have liked to draw her out, but though she murmured and smiled and seemed to be enjoying what he told her, he remained conscious of that mysterious remoteness which constituted half her fascination. He could not bear women who threw their shoulders and eyes at you and chattered away, or hard-mouthed women who laid down the law and knew more than you did. There was only one quality in a woman that appealed to him: charm, and the quieter it was, the more he liked it. And this one had charm, shadowy as afternoon sunlight on those Italian hills and valleys he had loved. The feeling, too, that she was, as it were, apart, cloistered, made her seem nearer to himself, a strangely desirable companion. When a man is very old and quite out of the running, he loves to feel secure from the rivalries of youth, for he would still be first in the heart of beauty. And he drank his hock and watched her lips, and felt nearly young. But the dog Balthasar lay watching her lips too, and despising in his heart the interruptions of their talk, and the tilting of those greenish glasses full of a golden fluid which was distasteful to him. The light was just failing when they went back into the music room, and cigar in mouth, old Jolyon said, "Play me some Chopin." By the cigars they smoke and the composers they love, ye shall know the texture of men's souls. Old Jolyon could not bear a strong cigar or Wagner's music. He loved Beethoven and Mozart, Handel and Gluck, and Schumann, and, for some occult reason, the operas of Meyerbeer. But of late years he had been seduced by Chopin, just as in painting he had succumbed to Botticelli. In yielding to these tastes he had been conscious of divergence from the standard of the Golden Age. Their poetry was not that of Milton and Byron and Tennyson, of Raphael and Titian, Mozart and Beethoven. It was, as it were, behind the veil. Their poetry hit no one in the face, but slipped its fingers under the ribs and turned and twisted and melted up the heart. And, never certain that this was healthy, he did not care a rap so long as he could see the pictures of the one or hear the music of the other. Irene sat down at the piano under the electric lamp festooned with pearl grey, and old Jolyon, in an armchair whence he could see her, crossed his legs and drew slowly at his cigar. She sat a few moments with her hands on the keys, evidently searching her mind for what to give him. Then she began, and within old Jolyon there arose a sorrowful pleasure, not quite like anything else in the world. He fell slowly into a trance, interrupted only by the movements of taking the cigar out of his mouth at long intervals and replacing it. She was there, and the hock within him, and the scent of tobacco, but there too was a world of sunshine lingering into moonlight, and pools with stalks upon them, and bluish trees above, glowing with blurs of wine-red roses, and fields of lavender where milk-white cows were grazing, and a woman all shadowy, with dark eyes and a white neck, smiled holding out her arms, and through air which was like music a star dropped, and was caught on a cow's horn. He opened his eyes. Beautiful piece, she played well, the touch of an angel. And he closed them again. He felt miraculously sad and happy, as one does standing under a lime tree in full honey flower. Not live one's own life again, but just stand there and bask in the smile of a woman's eyes, and enjoy the bouquet. And he jerked his hand. The dog Balthasar had reached up and licked it. "Beautiful," he said. "Go on, more Chopin." She began to play again. This time the resemblance between her and Chopin struck him. The swaying he had noticed in her walk was in her playing too, and the nocturne she had chosen, and the soft darkness of her eyes, the light on her hair as of moonlight from a golden moon. Seductive, yes, but nothing of Delilah in her or in that music. A long blue spiral from his cigar ascended and dispersed. So we go out, he thought. No more beauty. Nothing? Again Irene stopped. Would you like some Gluck? He used to write his music in a sunlit garden with a bottle of Rhine wine beside him. Oh yes, let's have Orfeo. Round about him now were fields of gold and silver flowers, white forms swaying in the sunlight, bright birds flying to and fro. All was summer. Lingering waves of sweetness and regret flooded his soul. Some cigar ash dropped, and taking out the silk handkerchief to brush it off, he inhaled a mingled scent as of snuff and eau de cologne. Ah, he thought, Indian summer, that is all. And he said, "You haven't played me Che faro." She did not answer, did not move. He was conscious of something, some strange upset. Suddenly he saw her rise and turn away, and a pang of remorse shot through him. What a clumsy chap! Like Orpheus, she too was looking for her lost one in the hall of memory. And disturbed to the heart, he got up from his chair. She had gone to the great window at the far end. Gingerly he followed. Her hands were folded over her breast. He could just see her cheek, very white. And quite emotionalized, he said, "There, there, my love." The words had escaped him mechanically, for they were those he used to Holly when she had a pain, but their effect was instantaneously distressing. She raised her arms, covered her face with them, and wept. Old Jolyon stood gazing at her with eyes very deep from age. The passionate shame she seemed feeling at her abandonment, so unlike the control and quietude of her whole presence, was as if she had never before broken down in the presence of another being. "There, there, there, there," he murmured, and putting his hand out reverently, touched her. She turned and leaned the arms which covered her face against him. Old Jolyon stood very still, keeping one thin hand on her shoulder. Let her cry her heart out. It would do her good. And the dog Balthasar, puzzled, sat down on his turn to examine them. The window was still open, the curtains had not been drawn. The last of daylight from without mingled with faint intrusion from the lamp within. There was a scent of new-mown grass. With the wisdom of a long life, old Jolyon did not speak. Even grief sobbed itself out in time. Only time was good for sorrow. Time who saw the passing of each mood, each emotion in turn. Time the layer to rest. There came into his mind the words, "As panteth the heart after cooling streams," but they were of no use to him. Then, conscious of a scent of violets, he knew she was drying her eyes. He put his chin forward, pressed his moustache against her forehead, and felt her shake with a quivering of her whole body, as of a tree which shakes itself free of raindrops. She put his hand to her lips, as if saying, "All over now, forgive me." The kiss filled him with a strange comfort. He led her back to where she had been so upset. And the dog Balthasar, following, laid the bone of one of the cutlets they had eaten at their feet. Anxious to obliterate the memory of that emotion, he could think of nothing better than China, and moving with her slowly from cabinet to cabinet, he kept taking up bits of Dresden and Lowestoft and Chelsea, turning them round and round with his thin, veined hands, whose skin, faintly freckled, had such an aged look. "I bought this at Jobson's," he would say. "Cost me £30. It's very old. That dog leaves his bones all over the place. This old ship bowl I picked up at the sale when that precious rip the Marquis came to grief. But you don't remember. Here is a nice piece of Chelsea. Now what would you say this was?" And he was comforted, feeling that with her taste she was taking a real interest in these things, for after all nothing better composes the nerves than a doubtful piece of china. When the crunch of the carriage wheels was heard at last, he said: "You must come again. You must come to lunch. Then I can show you these by daylight. And my little sweet. She's a dear little thing. This dog seems to have taken a fancy to you." For Balthasar, feeling that she was about to leave, was rubbing his side against her leg. Going out under the porch with her, he said: "He will get you up in an hour and a quarter. Take this for your protégés," and he slipped a cheque for £50 into her hand. He saw her brightened eyes and heard her murmur, "Oh, Uncle Jolyon!" and a real throb of pleasure went through him. That meant one or two poor creatures helped a little, and it meant that she would come again. He put his hand in at the window and grasped hers once more. The carriage rolled away. He stood looking at the moon and the shadows of the trees and thought, "A sweet night, she—" End of An Indian Summer of a Forsyte, Part 1. Reading by Eva Harnick. Indian Summer of a Forsyte, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, in Chancery. Indian Summer of a Forsyte, Part 2. 2 days of rain and summer set in bland and sunny. Old Jolyon walked and talked with Holly. At first he felt taller and full of a new vigour. Then he felt restless. Almost every afternoon they would enter the coppice and walk as far as the log. "Well, she's not there," he would think. "Of course not." And he would feel a little shorter and drag his feet walking up the hill home, with his hand clapped to his left side. Now and then the thought would move in him: "Did she come, or did I dream it?" And he would stare at space, while the dog Balthasar stared at him. Of course she would not come again. He opened the letters from Spain with less excitement. They were not returning till July. He felt oddly that he could bear it. Every day at dinner he screwed up his eyes and looked at where she had sat. She was not there, so he unscrewed his eyes again. On the 7th afternoon he thought, "I must go up and get some boots." He ordered Beacon and set out. Passing from Putney to Hyde Park, he reflected, "I might as well go to Chelsea and see her." And he called out, "Just drive me to where you took that lady the other night." The coachman turned his broad red face, and his juicy lips answered, "The lady in grey, sir?" "Yes, the lady in grey." What other ladies were there? Stodgy chap. The carriage stopped before a small three-storied block of flats standing a little back from the river. With a practised eye old Jolyon saw that they were cheap. "I should think about £60 a year," he mused, and entering he looked at the name board. The name Forsyte was not on it, but against "First floor, flat C" were the words "Mrs. Irene Heron." Ah, she had taken her maiden name again! And somehow this pleased him. He went upstairs slowly, feeling his side a little. He stood a moment before ringing, to lose the feeling of drag and fluttering there. She would not be in. And then boots! The thought was black. What did he want with boots at his age? He could not wear out all those he had. "Your mistress at home?" "Yes, sir. Say Mr. Jolyon Forsyte." "Yes, sir. Will you come this way?" Old Jolyon followed a very little maid, not more than 16, one would say, into a very small drawing room where the sunblinds were drawn. It held a cottage piano and little else save a vague fragrance and good taste. He stood in the middle with his top hat in his hand and thought, "I expect she's very badly off." There was a mirror above the fireplace, and he saw himself reflected. An old-looking chap. He heard a rustle and turned round. She was so close that his moustache almost brushed her forehead just under her hair. "I was driving up," he said. "I thought I would look in on you and ask you how you got up the other night." And seeing her smile, he felt suddenly relieved. She was really glad to see him. Perhaps. "Would you like to put on your hat and come for a drive in the park?" But while she was gone to put her hat on, he frowned. The park! James and Emily, Mrs. Nicholas, or some other member of his precious family would be there, very likely, prancing up and down. And they would go and wag their tongues about having seen him with her afterwards. Better not. He did not wish to revive the echoes of the past on Forsyte 'Change. He removed a white hair from the lapel of his closely buttoned-up frock-coat, and passed his hand over his cheeks, moustache, and square chin. It felt very hollow there under the cheekbones. He had not been eating much lately. He had better get that little whipper-snapper who attended Holly to give him a tonic. But she had come back, and when they were in the carriage, he said: "Suppose we go and sit in Kensington Gardens instead," and added with a twinkle, "No prancing up and down there," as if she had been in the secret of his thoughts. Leaving the carriage, they entered those select precincts and strolled towards the water. "You have gone back to your maiden name, I see," he said. "I am not sorry." She slipped her hand under his arm. "Has June forgiven me, Uncle Jolyon?" He answered gently, "Yes, yes, of course. Why not?" "And have you?" I forgave you as soon as I saw how the land really lay." And perhaps he had. His instinct had always been to forgive the beautiful. She drew a deep breath. "I never regretted. I couldn't. Did you ever love very deeply, Uncle Jolyon?" At that strange question old Jolyon stared before him. Had he? He did not seem to remember that he ever had. But he did not like to say this to the young woman whose hand was touching his arm, whose life was suspended, as it were, by memory of a tragic love. And he thought, "If I had met you when I was young, I might have made a fool of myself, perhaps." and a longing to escape in generalities beset him. "Love is a queer thing," he said, "fatal thing often. It was the Greeks, wasn't it, made love into a goddess? They were right, I dare say, but then they lived in the Golden Age." Phil adored them. Phil. The word jarred him, for suddenly, with his power to see all round the thing, he perceived why she was putting up with him like this. She wanted to talk about her lover. Well, if it was any pleasure to her. And he said, "Ah, there was a bit of a sculptor in him, I fancy." Yes, he loved balance and symmetry. He loved the whole-hearted way the Greeks gave themselves to art. Balance? The chap had no balance at all, if he remembered. As for symmetry, clean built enough he was, no doubt, but those queer eyes of his, and high cheekbones, symmetry? "You are of the Golden Age too, Uncle Jolyon." Old Jolyon looked round at her. Was she chaffing him? No, her eyes were soft as velvet. Was she flattering him? But if so, why? There was nothing to be had out of an old chap like him. Phil thought so. He used to say, "But I can never tell him that I admire him." Ah, there it was again, her dead lover, her desire to talk of him. And he pressed her arm, half resentful of those memories, half grateful, as if he recognized what a link they were between herself and him. "He was a very talented young fellow," he murmured. "It is hot. I feel the heat nowadays. Let us sit down." They took 2 chairs beneath a chestnut tree whose broad leaves covered them from the peaceful glory of the afternoon. A pleasure to sit there and watch her, and feel that she liked to be with him, and the wish to increase that liking if he could, made him go on. "I expect he showed you a side of him I never saw. He would be at his best with you. His ideas of art were a little new to me." He had stiffed the word fangled. "Yes, but he used to say you had a real sense of beauty." Old Jolyon thought, the devil he did, but answered with a twinkle, "Well, I have, or I shouldn't be sitting here with you." She was fascinating when she smiled with her eyes like that. He thought you had one of those hearts that never grow old. Phil had real insight. He was not taken in by this flattery spoken out of the past, out of a longing to talk of her dead lover, not a bit. And yet it was precious to hear, because she pleased his eyes and heart, which, quite true, had never grown old. Was that because, unlike her and her dead lover, he had never loved to desperation, had always kept his balance, his sense of symmetry? Well, it had left him power, at 84, to admire beauty. And he thought, "If I were a painter or a sculptor, but I'm an old chap. Make hay while the sun shines." A couple, with arms entwined, crossed on the grass before them, at the edge of the shadow from their tree. The sunlight fell cruelly on their pale, squashed, unkempt young faces. "We are an ugly lot," said old Jolyon suddenly. "It amazes me to see how love triumphs over that." "Love triumphs over everything. The young think so," he muttered. "Love has no age, no limit, and no death." With that glow in her pale face, her breast heaving, her eyes so large and dark and soft, she looked like Venus come to life. But this extravagance brought instant reaction, and twinkling he said, "Well, if it had limits we should not be born, for by George, it has got a lot to put up with." Then, removing his top hat, he brushed it round with a cuff. The great clumsy thing heated his forehead. In these days he often got a rush of blood to the head. His circulation was not what it had been. She still sat gazing straight before her, and suddenly she murmured, "It is strange enough that I am alive." Those words of Jo's, wild and lost, came back to him. "Ah," he said, "my son saw you for a moment that day." "Was it your son?" "I heard a voice in the hall. I thought for a second it was Phil." Old Jolyon saw her lips tremble. She put her hand over them, took it away again, and went on calmly. "That night I went to the Embankment. A woman caught me by the dress. She told me about herself. When one knows that others suffer, one is ashamed." "One of those?" She nodded, and horror stirred within old Jolyon. The horror of one who has never known a struggle with desperation. Almost against his will he muttered, "Tell me, won't you?" "I didn't care whether I lived or died. When you are like that, fate ceases to want to kill you. She took care of me 3 days. She never left me. I had no money. That is why I do what I can for them now." But old Jolyon was thinking, no money? What fate could compare with that? Every other was involved in it. "I wish you had come to me," he said. "Why didn't you?" But Irene did not answer. "Because my name was Forsyte, I suppose. Or was it June who kept you away? How are you getting on now?" His eyes involuntarily swept her body. Perhaps even now she was. And yet she wasn't thin, not really. "Oh, with my £50 a year I make just enough." The answer did not reassure him. He had lost confidence. And that fellow Soames! But his sense of justice stifled condemnation. No, she would certainly have died rather than take another penny from him. Soft as she looked, there must be strength in her somewhere, strength and fidelity. But what business had young Bosinney to have got run over and left her stranded like this? "Well, you must come to me now," he said, "for anything you want, or I shall be quite cut up." And putting on his hat he rose. "Let us go and get some tea. I told that lazy chap to put the horses up for an hour, and come for me at your place." "We will take a cab presently. I can't walk as I used to." He enjoyed that stroll to the Kensington end of the Gardens, the sound of her voice, the glancing of her eyes, the subtle beauty of a charming form moving beside him. He enjoyed their tea at Ruffles's in the High Street, and came out thence with a great box of chocolates swung on his little finger. He enjoyed the drive back to Chelsea in a hansom, smoking his cigar. She had promised to come down next Sunday and play to him again, and already in thought he was plucking carnations and early roses for her to carry back to town. It was a pleasure to give her a little pleasure, if it were pleasure from an old chap like him. The carriage was already there when they arrived. Just like that fella who was always late when he was wanted. Old Jolyon went in for a minute to say good-bye. The little dark hall of the flat was impregnated with a disagreeable odour of patchouli, and on a bench against the wall, its only furniture, he saw a figure sitting. He heard Irene say softly, "Just 1 minute." In the little drawing-room, when the door was shut, he asked gravely, "One of your protégées?" "Yes. Now, thanks to you, I can do something for her." He stood staring and stroking that chin whose strength had frightened so many in its time. The idea of her thus actually in contact with this outcast grieved and frightened him. What could she do for them? Nothing. Only soil and make trouble for herself, perhaps. And he said, "Take care, my dear. The world puts the worst construction on everything." "I know that." He was abashed by her quiet smile. "Well then, Sunday," he murmured. "Good-bye." She put her cheek forward for him to kiss. "Good-bye," he said again. "Take care of yourself." And he went out, not looking towards the figure on the bench. He drove home by way of Hammersmith, that he might stop at a place he knew of, and tell them to send her in 24 of their best Burgundy. She must want picking up sometimes. Only in Richmond Park did he remember that he had gone up to order himself some boots, and was surprised that he could have had so paltry an idea. End of Part 2. Indian Summer of a Forsyte. Recording by Eva Harnick. Indian Summer of a Forsyte, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, in Chancery. Indian Summer of a Forsyte, Part 3. The little spirits of the past, which throng an old man's days, had never pushed their faces up to his so seldom as in the 70 hours elapsing before Sunday came. The spirit of the future, with the charm of the unknown, put up her lips instead. Old Jolyon was not restless now, and paid no visits to the log, because she was coming to lunch. There is wonderful finality about a meal. It removes a world of doubts, for no one misses meals except for reasons beyond control. He played many games with Holly on the lawn, pitching them up to her, who was betting so as to be ready to bowl to Jolly in the holidays. For she was not a Forsyte, but Jolly was, and Forsytes always bet until they have resigned and reached the age of 85. The dog Balthazar, in attendance, lay on the ball as often as he could, and the page boy fielded till his face was like the harvest moon. And because the time was getting shorter, each day was longer and more golden than the last. On Friday night he took a liver pill. His sight hurt him rather, and though it was not the liver side, there is no remedy like that. Anyone telling him that he had found a new excitement in life, and that excitement was not good for him, would have been met by one of those steady and rather defiant looks of his deep-set iron-grey eyes, which seemed to say, "I know my own business best." He always had, and always would. On Sunday morning, when Holly had gone with her governess to church, he visited the strawberry beds. There, accompanied by the dog Balthazar, he examined the plants narrowly, and succeeded in finding at least 2 dozen berries which were really ripe. Stooping was not good for him, and he became very dizzy and red in the forehead. Having placed the strawberries in a dish on the dining table, he washed his hands and bathed his forehead with eau de cologne. There, before the mirror, it occurred to him that he was thinner. What a threadpaper he had been when he was young! It was nice to be slim. He could not bear a fat chap. And yet perhaps his cheeks were too thin. She was to arrive by train at 12:30 and walk up, entering from the road past Drage's farm at the far end of the coppice. And having looked into June's room to see that there was hot water ready, he set forth to meet her, leisurely, for his heart was beating. The air smelled sweet, larks sang, and the grand stand at Epsom was visible. A perfect day. On just such a one, no doubt, 6 years ago, Soames had brought young Bosinney down with him to look at the site before they began to build. It was Bosinney who had pitched on the exact spot for the house, as June had often told him. In these days he was thinking much about that young fellow, as if his spirit were really haunting the field of his last work, on the chance of seeing her. Bosinney, the one man who had possessed her heart, to whom she had given her whole self with rapture. At his age one could not, of course, imagine such things, but there stirred in him a queer, vague aching, as it were the ghost of an impersonal jealousy, and a feeling, too, more generous, of pity for that love so early lost. All over in a few poor months. Well, well. He looked at his watch before entering the coppice. Only 1/4 past, 25 minutes to wait. And then, turning the corner of the path, he saw her exactly where he had seen her the first time, on the log, and realized that she must have come by the earlier train to sit there alone for a couple of hours at least. 2 hours of her society missed. What memory could make that log so dear to her? His face showed what he was thinking, for she said at once: "Forgive me, Uncle Jolyon. It was here that I first knew." "Yes, yes, there it is for you, whenever you like. You're looking a little Londony. You're giving too many lessons." That she should have to give lessons worried him. Lessons to a parcel of young girls thumping out scales with their thick fingers. "Where do you go to give them?" he asked. "They're mostly Jewish families, luckily." Old Jolyon stared. To all Forsytes, Jews seemed strange and doubtful. "They love music, and they're very kind." "They had better be, by George!" He took her arm, his side always hurt him a little going uphill, and said: "Did you ever see anything like those buttercups? They came like that in a night." Her eyes seemed really to fly over the field, like bees after the flowers and the honey. "I wanted you to see them, wouldn't let them turn the cows in yet." Then, remembering that she had come to talk about Bosinney, he pointed to the clock tower over the stables. "I expect he would not have let me put that there. Had no notion of time, if I remember." But pressing his arm to her, she talked of flowers instead, and he knew it was done that he might not feel she came because of her dead lover. "The best flower I can show you," he said with a sort of triumph, "is my little sweet. She will be back from church directly. There is something about her which reminds me a little of you." And it did not seem to him peculiar that he had put it thus, instead of saying, there is something about you which reminds me a little of her." Ah, and here she was! Holly, followed closely by her elderly French governess, whose digestion had been ruined 22 years ago in the siege of Strasbourg, came rushing towards them from under the oak tree. She stopped about a dozen yards away to pat Balthasar and pretend that this was all she had in her mind. Old Jolyon, who knew better, said, "Well, my darling, here is the lady in grey I promised you." Holly raised herself and looked up. He watched the two of them with a twinkle, Irene smiling, Holly beginning with grave inquiry, passing into a shy smile too, and then to something deeper. She had a sense of beauty, that child, knew what was what. He enjoyed the sight of the kiss between them. "Mrs. Heron, Mam'zelle both. Well, Mam'zelle, good sermon?" For now that he had not much more time before him, the only part of the service connected with this world absorbed what interest in church remained to him. Mam'zelle Beauce stretched out a spidery hand clad in a black kid glove—she had been in the best families—and the rather sad eyes of her lean yellowish face seemed to ask, "Are you well bred?" Whenever Holly or Jolly did anything unpleasing to her, a not uncommon occurrence, she would say to them, "The little Tylers never did that, they were such well-bred little children." Jolly hated the little Tylers. Holly wondered dreadfully how it was she fell so short of them. A thin, rum little soul old Jolyon thought her, Mam'zelle Beauce. Luncheon was a successful meal. The mushrooms, which he himself had picked in the mushroom house, his chosen strawberries, and another bottle of the Steinberg cabinet, filled him with a certain aromatic spirituality and a conviction that he would have a touch of eczema tomorrow. After lunch they sat under the oak tree drinking Turkish coffee. It was no matter of grief to him when Mademoiselle Beauce withdrew to write her Sunday letter to her sister, whose future had been endangered in the past by swallowing a pin, an event held up daily in warning to the children to eat slowly and digest what they had eaten. At the foot of the bank, on a carriage rug, Holly and the dog Balthasar teased and loved each other, and in the shade old Jolyon, with his legs crossed and his cigar luxuriously savoured, gazed at Irene sitting in the swing, a light, vaguely swaying grey figure, with a fleck of sunlight here and there upon it, lips just opened, eyes dark and soft, under lids a little drooped. She looked content. Surely it did her good to come and see him. The selfishness of age had not set its proper grip on him, for he could still feel pleasure in the pleasure of others, realizing that what he wanted, though much, was not quite all that mattered. "It is quiet here," he said. "You must not come down if you find it dull, but it is a pleasure to see you. My little sweet is the only face which gives me any pleasure, except yours." From her smile he knew that she was not beyond liking to be appreciated, and this reassured him. "That's not humbug," he said. "I never told a woman I admired her when I didn't. In fact, I don't know when I have told a woman I admired her, except my wife in the old days. And wives are funny." He was silent, but resumed abruptly. "She used to expect me to say it more often than I felt it, and there we were." Her face looked mysteriously troubled, and afraid that he had said something painful, he hurried on. "When my little sweet marries, I hope she will find someone who knows what women feel. I shan't be here to see it, but there is too much topsy-turvydom in marriage. I don't want her to pitch up against that." And aware that he had made bad worse, he added, "That dog will scratch." A silence followed. Of what was she thinking? This pretty creature, whose life was spoiled, who had done with love, and yet was made for love. Some day, when he was gone, perhaps she would find another mate, not so disorderly as that young fellow who had got himself run over. Ah, but her husband? "Does Soames never trouble you?" he asked. She shook her head. Her face had closed up suddenly. For all her softness, there was something irreconcilable about her. And a glimpse of light on the inexorable nature of sex antipathies strayed into a brain which, belonging to early Victorian civilization, so much older than this of his old age, had never thought about such primitive things. "That's a comfort," he said. "You can see the grandstand to-day. Shall we take a turn round?" Through the flower and fruit garden, against whose high outer walls peach trees and nectarines were trained to the sun, through the stables, the vinery, the mushroom house, the asparagus beds, the rosery, the summer house, he conducted her, even into the kitchen garden, to see the tiny green peas which Holly loved to scoop out of their pods with her finger and lick up from the palm of her little brown hand. Many delightful things he showed her, while Holly and the dog Balthasar danced ahead, or came to them at intervals for attention. It was one of the happiest afternoons he had ever spent, but it tired him, and he was glad to sit down in the music room and let her give him tea. A special little friend of Holly's had come in, a fair child with short hair like a boy's, and the two sported in the distance, under the stairs, on the stairs, and up in the gallery. Old Jolyon begged for Chopin. She played studies, mazurkas, waltzes, till the two children, creeping near, stood at the foot of the piano, their dark and golden heads bent forward, listening. Old Jolyon watched. "Let us see you dance, you two." Shyly, with a false start, they began. Bobbing and circling, earnest, not very adroit, they went past and past his chair to the strains of that waltz. He watched them, and the face of her who was playing turned smiling towards those little dancers, thinking, "Sweetest picture I have seen for ages." A voice said, "Holly, mais enfin, qu'est-ce que tu fais là? Danser, le dimanche? Viens donc." But the children came close to old Jolyon, knowing that he would save them, and gazed into a face which was decidedly caught out. "Better the day, better the deed, mam'selle. It is all my doing. Trot along, chicks, and have your tea." And when they were gone, followed by the dog Balthasar, who took every meal, he looked at Irene with a twinkle and said, "Well, there we are. Aren't they sweet? Have you any little ones among your pupils?" "Yes, 3. 2 of them darlings." "Pretty?" "Lovely." Old Jolyon sighed. He had an insatiable appetite for the very young. "My little sweet," he said, "is devoted to music. She will be a musician some day. You wouldn't give me your opinion of her playing, I suppose?" "Of course I will." "You wouldn't like—" But he stifled the words to give her lessons. The idea that she gave lessons was unpleasant to him, yet it would mean that he would see her regularly. She left the piano and came over to his chair. "I would like very much, but there is June. When are they coming back?" Old Jolyon frowned. "Not till the middle of next month." What does that matter? You said June had forgiven me, but she could never forget Uncle Jolyon. Forget? She must forget if he wanted her to. But as if answering, Irene shook her head. You know, she couldn't. One does not forget. Always that wretched past. And he said with a sort of vexed finality, well, we shall see. He talked to her an hour or more, of the children and 100 little things, till the carriage came round to take her home. And when she had gone, he went back to his chair and sat there smoothing his face and chin, dreaming over the day. That evening, after dinner, he went to his study and took a sheet of paper. He stayed for some minutes without writing, then rose and stood under the masterpiece, Dutch Fishing Boats at Sunset. He was not thinking of that picture, but of his life. He was going to leave her something in his will. Nothing could so have stirred the stilly deeps of thought and memory. He was going to leave her a portion of his wealth, of his aspirations, deeds, qualities, work, all that had made that wealth. Going to leave her, too, a part of all he had missed in life, by his sane and steady pursuit of wealth. All. What had he missed? Dutch fishing boats responded blankly. He crossed to the French window, and drawing the curtain aside, opened it. A wind had got up, and one of last year's oak leaves, which had somehow survived the gardener's brooms, was dragging itself with a tiny clicking rustle along the stone terrace in the twilight. Except for that, it was very quiet out there, and he could smell the heliotrope watered not long since. A bat went by. A bird uttered its last cheep. And right above the oak tree the first star shone. Faust in the opera had bartered his soul for some fresh years of youth. Morbid notion! No such bargain was possible. That was real tragedy. No making oneself new again for love or life or anything. Nothing left to do but enjoy beauty from afar off while you could, and leave it something in your will. But how much? And as if he could not make that calculation looking out into the mild freedom of the country night, he turned back and went up to the chimney-piece. There were his pet bronzes, a Cleopatra with the asp at her breast, a Socrates, a greyhound playing with her puppy, a strong man reining in some horses. They last, he thought, and a pang went through his heart. They had 1,000 years of life before them. How much? Well, enough at all events to save her getting old before her time, to keep the lines out of her face as long as possible, and grey from soiling that bright hair. He might live another 5 years. She would be well over 30 by then. How much? She had none of his blood in her. In loyalty to the tenor of his life for 40 years and more, ever since he married and founded that mysterious thing, a family, came this warning thought: none of his blood, no right to anything. It was a luxury then, this notion, an extravagance, a petting of an old man's whim, one of those things done in dotage. His real future was vested in those who had his blood, in whom he would live on when he was gone. He turned away from the bronzes and stood looking at the old leather chair in which he had sat and smoked so many hundreds of cigars. And suddenly he seemed to see her sitting there in her grey dress, fragrant, soft, dark-eyed, graceful, looking up at him. Why? She cared nothing for him really. All she cared for was that lost lover of hers. But she was there, whether she would or no, giving him pleasure with her beauty and grace. One had no right to inflict an old man's company, no right to ask her down to play to him and let him look at her for no reward. Pleasure must be paid for in this world. How much? After all, there was plenty. His son and his 3 grandchildren would never miss that little lump. He had made it himself, nearly every penny. He could leave it where he liked. Allow himself this little pleasure. He went back to the bureau. Well, I am going to, he thought. Let them think what they like. I am going to. And he sat down. How much? 10,000, 20,000. How much? If only with his money he could buy 1 year, 1 month of use. And startled by that thought, he wrote quickly: Dear Herring, draw me a codicil to this effect. I leave to my niece Irene Forsyte, born Irene Heron, by which name she now goes, £15,000 free of legacy duty. Yours faithfully, Jolyon Forsyte. When he had sealed and stamped the envelope, he went back to the window and drew in a long breath. It was dark, but many stars shone now. End of Part 3. Indian Summer of a Forsyte. Reading by Eva Harnick.